I'm so excited to have the opportunity to introduce Janice, English language teacher trainer, award-winning ELT author with over 40 titles, among which the famous Life and World English, published by National Geographic Learning. He has run a lot of courses, workshops, and conferences all around the world. One of the latest was at Atlanta Episode International. I can say, and it was a great success. I can say that because I was there. And today he is going to explore again the importance of critical thinking skills and how to in ELT and how to integrate it in a daily teaching practice. So join me in welcoming Janice and enjoy this session.
Thank you very much. You can hear me at the back, yes? Yeah. Splendid, waving, lovely. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. It's great to be back in Rome. However, I enjoyed my pasta a little too much at lunchtime. And we've reached that Friday afternoon 3:30 feeling. So I shall try to keep you with me. And if I fall asleep over the pasta, then we've really got problems, okay? But I'm gonna stick with it, okay? I've heard the term 21st century skills, critical thinking, creative thinking mentioned a lot today. And I'm going to be talking about critical thinking as well. But the origins of this talk are very much to do with me being a teacher at a conference about 10 years ago, and somebody told me that 21st century skills are very important. And I didn't really know why. Because I was just happy teaching English. Why do I suddenly have to be in charge of teaching lots of other skills and doing lots of other things? So it sort of sent me down the path of exploration. So we're going to follow that path of exploration a little bit in this talk. As you know, there are 4 C's in 21st century skills. There was the first C, collaboration, and I thought as an English teacher, great, I do that, pair work, group work, all of that, they collaborate. So I was comfortable with that C. Communication, yeah, do lots of that, fine, that C's okay, tick, I do that in class, I get my students to communicate. Creativity was the 3rd C, and I thought, well, I like doing creative stuff with students, and we kind of reward creative teachers, don't we? We think creativity is a good thing in the classroom. So I was happy with that. But then we came to the 4th C, critical thinking, and I have to say, I didn't really know what it was exactly. And I turned to the person next to me at a conference and said, what exactly is critical thinking? And they whispered to me, I'm not sure either. And so it sort of continued around the conference. And when I did start, over the last 10 years, we're using the word critical thinking all the time, I discovered there are lots and lots of different definitions. And when I started to look at the literature, there are lots of different definitions. I started to wonder, well, what's its kind of relevance to me? And something happened to me in the classroom one day that made me think, well, maybe as an English language teacher, this has something to do with it. As well as writing course books and teacher training, I do some teaching in Oxford. I sometimes teach, I taught EAP at the university, but I also do some work with refugees and low-paid workers at sort of elementary level, okay? And my students look something like this. They probably look similar to your students. That's not working. There we go. I suspect because we're in Rome, your students are probably far better dressed. But other than that, your students have this universal sort of hunch position over their mobile devices, yes, and they're wandering around bent over them, and lots of you are wandering around bent over them these days as well. And this image, of course, reflects the concern that many educators have nowadays. These students are receiving all their information but are they thinking about it critically? And when you get standard definitions of critical thinking, quite often it's concerned with fact versus opinion. And it's concerned with the issues of fake news, post-truth, misinformation, disinformation, statisticulation. There's a whole variety of new vocabulary connected with the concern over the information coming through the mobile devices. But something happened to me in the classroom that was sort of brought it more home to me why critical thinking is perhaps important in the ELT classroom. I'll just tell you a story about a student. I had this student who's been living in the UK for about 2 years. He comes from East Timor. He had to leave his country. And he joined my elementary class. And he's been with me quite a long time. Let me put it like this, he's not one of my greatest successes. I feel as a teacher I haven't quite moved him on. But he's a very smiley, friendly student, always happy, pleasure to have in class. I have about 15 students, they sit in a horseshoe, and my student from East Timor always sits on my right, because he feels like being closest to the teacher who will somehow learn more from me. You know this student? Yeah, you've seen this student. So one day, because these students come to live in Oxford, in England, I decided I was going to help them with buying second-hand objects, so that with the money they had, they could buy simple objects for the house. So I stayed up the night before, I made some beautiful posters. I put photographs on the posters, really simple elementary level English, for sale, bicycle, in good condition, £25. You know, low level vocabulary that I thought would help them buy some objects. And I handed out the posters to my students and I gave them a reading task. And I looked over, my student from East Timor, that day he'd arrived in the lesson very excited, because after 2 years of living in the UK, he'd finally been able to buy himself a mobile phone. And he came to class smiling, waving his mobile phone at everybody. We all nodded approvingly, yes, very nice mobile phone, looks like every other mobile phone, but it was a very nice one. And I handed out the posters, and he had a poster that said, for sale, chair and desk. And a picture of a chair and a desk. £25, and it had some words to describe the object. It was the sort of thing he might need to buy second-hand, so I thought it was a useful lesson. So I hand out the posters, and then the students all start reading. And as a teacher, I sort of monitored. You know how we monitor in reading lessons because we're not really sure what we ought to do. We just feel like we should be standing and monitoring. Anyway, I'm monitoring, and I wander over and I look across at my student from East Timor, and he's half looking at my poster, but he's got his new mobile phone, and I think, oh crikey, already he's developing bad habits in class with his mobile phone. He's typing in his phone. And I look down to see what he's doing, and he's typing into the phone CHAIR. He's got Google Translate open. And I go over to him, and I've got my patient, benign, smiling teacher expression on. And I gesture in a large way to the photograph of the chair and the word chair that's written. And inside I'm going, God, it's a chair! Isn't it obvious? That's just... But we shield it, and we have our patient's teacher face on it. And he looks at me, and he's such a nice guy, and he's smiling at me, and I think, okay. So he's looking at, and he nods at me, as if he's understood. He doesn't need to use his phone, he can work it out from context, look at the picture of the chair, and type. So I go off, and I wander this way to do a bit more monitoring. And I look back, and he's typing again. I'm thinking, what's he typing now? He's got his phone. He's typing D-E-S-K. And I just think, forget it. Okay, just let him get on with it. Until finally, the task is finishing, and my student holds up his phone, waves it at me to show me that, yes, the teacher, you are correct. That's a desk, and that's a chair, because Google Translate says it is. How does that make me feel? And there is a question, there's a very good book that was written about why do we need a teacher when we've got Google? And it's a real, honest question. Fascinating book. And a very strong argument of it is that actually the role of the teacher perhaps is less concerned with maybe the lower order thinking because the technology can provide it, but we are more and more increasingly concerned with the higher order thinking. So is it the role of the teacher to take the students there and help them become more autonomous as learners? So when I saw that, I thought, well, maybe this critical thinking's got something to it. Maybe there's something to higher order thinking. What I did next was I did some reading around, and then I did an online survey to get teachers from around the world to write their own definitions of what they thought critical thinking was, because I was interested, particularly English language teachers. So I put this questionnaire online, and I know teachers from different continents, and I invited them to take part. And one of the tasks that I gave them was critical thinking is. And I said, can you complete that sentence in about no more than 10 words? What I want is a nice, short, quick, simple definition of what you think critical thinking is. In a minute, I'm going to show you some responses. Before I do, for 1 minute, can you turn to the person next to you, see if you can agree what you think critical thinking is. Just complete the sentence. Okay, 1 minute, off you go. Have a chat. Somewhere. Have you said something similar? Just have a quick read and look. Okay. I've selected these because they kind of, when teachers come up with these definitions, they almost reflect the history of critical thinking. The first one, to reflect and analyse an argument, to look for the evidence. It comes from John Dewey's work in 1910, where he talks about critical thinking for the first time. He was concerned that it was looking for evidence to support an argument. And that definition of critical thinking continues to exist, particularly in English for Academic Purposes books. You'll see it in study skills books, EAP books. That's often the view of critical thinking there. If we come further along, we get this word questioning everything. That's very much tied up with the work of Paulo Freire, who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a Brazilian educator. And he took critical thinking a step further. He said it's not just about looking at the evidence, it's about dialogue. Freire criticised the system of education where you had the teacher at the front of the class just passing information to the students in a sort of what he described as a banking concept. It was just passing over information. The students received it, didn't do anything with it. He wanted the students to ask questions and to start having a dialogue, a discussion, so teaching became more of a sharing experience. And so finally we get down here, we get onto using higher level thinking, and obviously then we start thinking of Bloom's taxonomy and this idea of lower and higher order thinking. Bloom never actually uses the term critical thinking, and it's only later in the revision where the revision in 2001 they start to ask, well, where does critical thinking fit into the idea of lower and higher order thinking? And you kind of get this idea that we have a scale of lower order thinking to higher order. And the lower order thinking is very much concerned with basic comprehension. You teach students a word, they use it. You teach them an item of grammar, they use it. Typical exercise types might be gap fills, answering true-false questions, answering yes-no questions. Teachers do this a lot, particularly in the English language classroom. If we're not doing this a lot of the time, then maybe we shouldn't be teaching, because we're helping students with basic comprehension. In Bloom's taxonomy, it tends to relate to remembering, understanding, and applying. Then we get to critical thinking, which is more about analysing and evaluating. And it's the point where students start to ask questions. Maybe they study the language and they try to work out their rule using their own questioning skills. And finally, the highest order is more creative thinking. Students go off and they create something new. Maybe they give a presentation, they write a story. It could be a variety of activities. The problem with the representation of Bloom, often in English language teaching, is presented as 6 separate steps that you kind of have to go up to reach the top. That wasn't what he was intending at all. It was more that it was a movement from lower to higher order thinking throughout any lesson. When we plan lessons, we should always be trying to achieve different levels of thinking. So we have to see critical thinking within context. Once we do that, I think it can impact on us. By the way, I'm going to give you a link to the slides at the end, so don't worry if you don't get everything down. It can impact the questions we ask. Critical thinking impacts the exercises, the types of materials we select. And I'm going to argue at the end that if we really want students to be effective creative thinkers, they have to be effective critical thinkers. So it impacts creative thinking, and I'll show you the connection in a few minutes. Let's start with questioning. We're teachers, we ask a lot of questions, yeah? In 2001, there was some research done into classes in the UK. They did 2 sets of research, and they analysed the types of questions that teachers were asking. This tells us quite a lot about how we use questions in lower and higher order thinking. On average, they found that the typical teacher asked 2 questions per minute. That's 400 in a day. How does that make you feel? If you've been teaching for about 25 to 30 years, we'll do the maths, you've probably asked about 70,000 a year, that's 2 to 4 million in your career. God, I feel great that I've spent the 30 years of my life doing that. Okay. They also analysed the question types in the 2 separate studies. In one study, only 4% of the questions were higher order thinking type questions. In the other, they were about 8%. Now, this is 2001. I suspect if you ran the study again 20 years later now, teachers are more aware of it. Maybe we've upped our game, I'm not sure. And we also have to bear in mind that of the 90+% lower order thinking questions, they probably included questions like, where's your course book and did you do your homework? So, you know, there's just classroom management stuff that we do as well. They started to look at the wait time that teachers gave. Typically, after a question, a typical teacher leaves about 1 second. And we know, particularly less experienced teachers, it's one of those things we do at the beginning, we don't leave time. They started to say, well, leave at least 3 seconds for lower order thinking questions, maybe at least 10 seconds for a question related to critical or creative thinking. And the other thing I thought was interesting, which tells us a lot, is that on average a student got to ask about one question per lesson. And if we really want a critical thinking classroom, then obviously we want our students to be asking more questions than that in our lessons. They need to be generating those questions. So how can we learn from this and apply it? Here's a little exercise for you. Imagine you're going to teach a lesson and you're going to use a photograph at the beginning of the lesson. Here's our photograph. What do you think the topic of the lesson is? Generations, experience, family possibly, communication, technology. A good photograph will be useful for lots of different types of classroom topics. But typically when we start a lesson, teachers show a photograph and then we ask questions to the students about the photograph, yeah? Quite often those questions are lower order thinking questions. Let's see how we could improve this. What I've got here is, I've got lower to higher order. I've got 9 questions about that photograph. With the person next to you, can you order them from the questions that you think are lower order thinking to the ones that you think higher? So the ones that check comprehension, the ones that are good for critical thinking, the ones that are good for creativity. Off you go. Quick exercise. Just have a quick look, similar-ish, may vary. A few sceptical looks there from some people. But what you basically are getting here is the what, why, and how questions. So these are the descriptive. This is checking students have the vocabulary to talk about the picture. Yeah? Then we get questions where they have to start making connections, speculating, they're analysing, they're evaluating the picture. If they have to come up with a title for the picture, it's a form of summarising, really. So they're analysing the picture and coming up with things. And then finally at the top we get more creative thinking type tasks with students writing dialogues and imagining things about the picture. Now you might put them in slightly different order, but we're getting that pattern. Now you see, as soon as we think about using a picture in the classroom and we apply the principles of lower, higher order thinking, we're getting more out of the picture and we're doing so much more with the material. Now I wouldn't necessarily do all of these in one lesson. I might bring it into one class, do the basic comprehension work, but I might bring the picture back later in the week to do the critical or the creative thinking tasks. as a kind of revision exercise and extension of the work I've been doing. So suddenly if I view my material like that, it makes life a lot easier. Certainly as a course book writer, this really helps me think about how I can get the most out of the material. When I work with teachers on lesson planning, it's a really useful skill to start seeing it as a kind of a scale. And I'm including plenty of higher order as well as lower order. Let's think about some of the other things we do as teachers. We teach grammar, yeah? I think so, yeah, good, all right. That's lovely. Right, here's a bit of grammar that you'll have all taught. Nothing very exciting in you. The past simple regular verbs. Everybody groans. Timeline. Example sentences. ED underlined. Definition. Use the past simple to talk about finish actions. Bang. You tell the students, they write it all down, or they look at it in the course book, and then they know it, yeah? And, of course, they love it because they suddenly discover you just add ED to everything. And then they make the verb go, and it all goes wrong. You can take a different approach, which again is a questioning approach, and you'll have all tried this out and used it. This is more of a guided discovery approach. You give them sentences with the past simple in, and you ask them questions about it, and they discover the rule. And if you pick up methodology books, we're often told that this is a better approach because it helps students with memory, and they're analysing and they're evaluating. But overall, would you say your students prefer approach 1 or 2? It probably varies. If it's Monday morning, 9 o'clock, and I'm teaching a class, and I start off with a guided discovery approach, my students suddenly say, "Teacher, stop. Just tell us the rule." Because they know my games, they know my questioning games. So sometimes they want that, and there is some grammar which lends itself to tell you the rule. If I teach articles or no articles with place names, I really haven't found a good way of teaching that using a guided discovery approach. I find it a lot easier just to give them a set of rules and then get them trying them out. If I'm teaching conditionals at higher levels, there's more subtlety. I can get them comparing sentences. I can get them using guided discovery. But we're essentially talking about the difference between lower and higher order thinking. We're just applying it to our everyday, the way we approach grammar, I think. Similarly, if I was teaching vocabulary, here's our friend the gap fill. I'm assuming everybody's used gap fills. I've written lots of them. They're very useful. I don't actually have a problem with them. At the moment, I'm trying to learn Chinese. When my Chinese teacher says, do exercise 3 in the book and it's gap fill, I just think, oh, this is great. I love it. I don't know if it's doing me any good, but it's very satisfying just to fill all the gaps in. So if I've been doing a lesson on things in the house, objects in the house, students fill the gaps, they do that in a minute or so. That's real lower order thinking stuff. It's just checking their understanding. If I want to push it up a bit of level, I give them this exercise. I say, now here are 5 other words we've looked at today. Get into pairs. Write 5 sentences, but create your own gap fill, because you know what a gap fill looks like, so be a materials writer and write your own gap fill. And then they fill, and then they write